Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here with you this morning, whether you're in the room or joining online. My name is Will. If I haven't met you before, it's nothing personal. I'm sure you're very nice. It's a real joy to be kicking off our Advent sermon series today, alongside my namesake, Other Will, who's kicking things off at Battersea. Today is a real Will special. And this series is perfect for the run-up to Christmas, because it's all about Emmanuel. Emmanuel is one of the many names or titles given to God throughout the Bible. In Matthew 1, we see Joseph, future father of Jesus, visited by an angel. The angel proclaims that the child Mary will give birth to will be called Emmanuel, which, if you've listened to Great is the One, we will keep plugging that song, you will know it literally translates as God with us. This is great news. Rather than worshipping a distant, far-off God, we get to worship one who is with us. Through Jesus, God came into the world as a human being, like you and like me. God is with us. In fact, that's such good news, I'm going to do my best Steve Bateman impression and ask you to turn to your neighbor and say, God is with us. Great. But just because we know in our heads that God is with us, it doesn't mean it always feels that way, especially when we're going through challenging times in our lives. Maybe we're waiting for guidance from God. Maybe we're yet to see answers to a prayer we've been praying for a long, long time. Maybe life is just really hard right now. How can we still experience and recognize God with us in the midst of disappointment and receding hope? That's what we're going to look at today. Sound good? Yeah, okay. You're going to hear it either way. So we're going to be looking at this truth that God is with us through the lens of the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth. And yeah, that's the title. I think it's maybe a bit harsh, Zechariah the Sceptic. You can make your own minds up as we go through, but I think he's maybe, a bit more than that. Maybe some of you are already familiar with this story. It's a great one and a challenging one. It's a story of great disappointment, of losing hope, of waiting in faith, and ultimately of God's promises being fulfilled. Like all great stories, it has great characters at its heart, characters who ring true to our experience of life and who tell us something about ourselves. Zechariah, in particular, is a reflection of our nature, righteous but imperfect. Zechariah is us. In fact, turn to your neighbor again and say, we are Zechariah. Nice. Okay, let's read the first half of this story. It's from Luke 1, 5 to 25, so grab your Bibles if you've got them, and it'll be up on the screen anyway. All right, this is from the NIV translation. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless, because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once, when Zechariah's division was on duty, and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshippers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and Sorry, like preaching on iPad sounds really good until you accidentally flick something and it all goes away. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he's born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Zechariah asked the angel, how can I be sure of this? I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years. The angel said to him, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. "The Lord has done this for me," she said. "In these days he has shown his favor and has taken away my disgrace among the people." So here we are in the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth. And at first, when you're reading it, it might not seem like a story of disappointment and challenge and losing hope. It feels like a story of victory. We meet Zechariah the priest, then straight away, he's been called into the temple to burn the incense. We hear about his struggles, him and Elizabeth's struggles to conceive a child, but a few verses later, that challenge is overcome. And of course, this is a story of victory. But when I read this, I feel like I'm not as drawn to the success bit, which is coming at the end, where they receive these blessings from God, even though obviously that's great. But what stood out to me is that even in the waiting of decades, and in a culture that's been waiting for centuries for their coming king, they managed to remain righteous and blameless in the sight of the Lord. Because this is a story that we've come into towards the end here. You know, it's like a film where you open up in the middle of the action, or maybe at the end, and then whoosh, flash back to the start to see how we got here. Or we're going to do a little whoosh of our own and look at the context of where Zechariah and Elizabeth, what they've been through, where they've come from. So as it says in verse 5, Zechariah was a priest. He was part of the priestly division of Abijah. This was one of about 24 divisions, each containing hundreds of priests, and each division would take it in turns to be on call to serve God in the temple. Only a handful of priests, however, in each of these shifts would be chosen at any time to work in the inner temple itself and to burn this ceremonial incense. This is a rare honor, which each priest only got to do once in their life. This was the pinnacle of their priest career. And as a man advanced in years, Zechariah must have been wondering if he would ever be chosen, if he would ever be blessed in this way, to be able to burn this incense offering before the Lord. And this longing, this waiting and hoping, maybe forlornly, a hope that might never be realized, is mirrored in their personal desire to conceive a child. I don't know what the average age of becoming parents was back then, but the passage makes it clear that whatever it was, Zechariah and Elizabeth were well past it. This must have been an incredible sadness for them, one that endured for many, many years up to this point. And this wouldn't have just taken an extreme emotional toll on them, but would have given rise to social and economic worries as well. Without an heir to help provide for her financially and emotionally in the event of Zechariah's death, Elizabeth was in a really precarious position. This is something that would have been playing on her mind more and more as the months and years passed, I'm sure. In those days, pregnancy was also seen as a reflection of God's blessing. So many in their community may have wondered what they had done to be denied this gift. Elizabeth goes so far as calling it a disgrace among the people, a source of great shame. For a couple who were righteous and blameless in the sight of the Lord, this would have felt like such an injustice. They must have felt abandoned, like God was not with them. And then to add one more forlorn hope into the mix, this is the last one, we have the longing, the waiting of the people of Israel for their coming Messiah. This is a nation that has become spiritually barren, with no major prophetic revelations for the 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and now. A nation losing sight of hope in the prophecies that have previously sustained them for generations. Like that one in Isaiah 9:6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. But I imagine by this point that a coming Messiah had never felt further away. So this is the context. Zechariah and Elizabeth would have been far from the only people feeling abandoned here. Where is this Messiah? Where is this victory over the oppression of Roman rule? Where is this great ruler? Where is our God? The people of Israel are waiting in the same way for God's promises to come to pass. And as I've been saying this, I hope you've been recognizing that this isn't just a story about a couple from 2,000 years ago. This is a story about us. We're all Zechariah, remember? This is a universal feeling and experience. We all have things that we're waiting for, hoping for, maybe things we've lost hope of ever seeing happen. I'm sure I don't have to list them. I bet everyone in this room has something in their mind already, something that you couldn't stop thinking about as we've been talking. I know I have. The questions that the Israelites were asking themselves back then are the same ones we ask ourselves now. And the problem is, of course, that the waiting, that erosion of hope and even faith, can leave us completely unprepared for when God shows up. Zechariah clearly is. He literally can't believe it, which is a totally natural human response. It's based on a human understanding, but not a God understanding. So somehow, we need to step out of our own understanding, our worldview, and tap into God's a little bit more. If we believe in this God, the one that's described in the Bible, then we can have absolute confidence that he's always with us. That's literally his name. But we don't always feel that way. We can't always feel his presence or see that he's with us. And the challenge in this is, how do we continue to trust God when times are tough? Well, we're going to look at how Zechariah and Elizabeth do it, because I think they're a great example to be learned from. How do they keep the faith and stay connected to God during their period of waiting? I've broken this down into 3 facets that I think we can see in how they handle this period of waiting. But it basically boils down to this. They went after and maintained an active relationship with God. They spent time on him, listened to him, and wanted to be changed by him. Let's have a look at how they did this. So first thing is prayer. One of the things we can be confident of about Zechariah and Elizabeth is that they prayed a lot. They were both raised in a priestly environment. Zechariah was a priest himself, and Elizabeth was a descendant of Aaron, brother of Moses, who was a high priest and a prophet. So theirs is very much a lineage of paying attention to God. Prayer would have been a central part of their lives, as we know from the fact that they were righteous and blameless in the sight of God. They were fully devoted to him. And when the angel appears to Zechariah in the temple and tells him of their impending pregnancy, he declares simply, "Your prayer has been answered." And I love this the use of the singular here, which is actually in all the translations I looked at. Your prayer. I think this is really meaningful. This desire for children isn't just one of many prayers to them. This is the prayer, singular. You can get that they would have been praying and praying to God for this blessing, even as it looked more and more impossible that it would be fulfilled. Just to add greater meaning, the angelic intervention happens as Zechariah is performing this ceremonial burning of incense. This was the ceremony itself that represented the lifting of the prayers of God's people up to him, just as the incense smoke goes up. Prayer is very much at the heart of this story. Now, over the past year, I've prayed more than I ever have before. Some of those have been happy, thankful prayers, but lots weren't. Lots were sorrowful, grieving prayers, prayers that were hard to pray, but ones that I have found to be so incredibly valuable to my relationship with God, because they took something of me. They came from deep within. It's these prayers that come from the grief and disappointment, from the waiting, sacrificial prayers like Zechariah and Elizabeth's, that can bring about a new depth and trust in our relationship with the Lord. We don't just get a good time God who we only have a surface-level relationship or friendship with. When times are good, when the going is easy, we get a God who feels our sadness and shares in it. A God who comforts those who mourn, as is promised in Isaiah 61. And through prayer, we get to go deeper in relationship with him, just like Elizabeth and Zechariah did, especially when times are tough. Number 2 is righteousness. What's the first thing we learn about Zechariah and Elizabeth? Well, it's not actually the first thing. We get some biographical details first. But the first thing we learn about their character is both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees perfectly. Wow. What a description that is to receive. Imagine being introduced like that. This is my friend Will. He observes all the Lord's commands and decrees perfectly. Wow. But this doesn't mean that they were perfect or without sin. As Jesus will demonstrate in a few decades' time, he's the only one who's without sin. But it means that when they did sin, they observed the proper rituals of the time and culture and had that sin dealt with. In this sweet post-Jesus era, we can do this without any of the ritualized sin offerings of the Old Testament. No fatted calves for us. Purely through the grace of Jesus, we have been made righteous before God. We're called only to turn away from the things we are doing which separate us from him. We have it a lot easier than Zechariah and Elizabeth because we have Jesus. But still, we get to choose how we respond to that free gift of grace, of relationship, of righteousness. We can choose to step into closer relationship with God, to live a life and make decisions that glorify him and put him at the center rather than ourselves. We can choose to learn to be like Jesus. And as we do this, we'll see him gently change our nature and mindset to more closely align with his. We are totally justified by God's grace, but this work of sanctification, of becoming like him, is a lifelong journey. And we allow close relationships around us to change us all the time. Close friendships or romantic relationships often change how we like to spend our time, our taste in music, our taste in food. They introduce us to new ideas. Have you noticed how often you pick up phrases or patterns of speech from those around you? And this is so true that we become like the people we spend time with. Jesus called us to follow him, to walk in his ways, to spend time with him. He is the shepherd. We are the sheep. He totally accepts us as we are, but he doesn't leave us where we are. He calls us higher. We don't have to slaughter a pigeon like Zechariah might have had to do, but there is still an active role to play, which is thankfully way more vegan-friendly in our faith journey. If we want a strong relationship with God, even in trying times, a relationship that sustains us when life is hard, this is really key. We can respond to this gift of righteousness by pursuing his ways and allowing ourselves to be changed by him. We want that God mindset, the one that isn't surprised when a miracle shows up because we've been expecting it. So let's have a little recap, because we're getting towards the end now. We've looked at this amazing story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, of their longing to see answered prayer, and the longing of the whole of Israel as well. We've looked at how their relationship with God sustained them during this time of waiting. We looked at their prayer life and their pursuit of God's ways, and finally, we're going to talk about worship, which is also great because it leads me seamlessly to the end of the story. In Luke 5:57 to 80, we jump forward a few months after a brief interlude with tracking the story of Mary to the birth of Zechariah and Elizabeth's baby, who will become John the Baptist. Not yet, of course. For now, he's just John the baby. After their enduring obedience results in John the baby's birth and naming, Zechariah instantly gets his speech back. Remember, he was robbed of his speech before. For the first time in 9 months. How does he respond? With a song of worship and prophecy. He praises God not just for what he has done, the gift of their child, but also what he will do. What Zechariah and all of Israel are still waiting for, the coming of the Messiah. We can choose to worship before we see those answers to prayer. We can worship based on our knowledge of who God is, our God mindset, not our environment, our circumstances, our experience. We can enrich our relationship with God by singing out truths about his nature and his character, and we can put God back on the throne of our lives. We can remember that God is with us. He does remember us and the desires of our hearts. We can take comfort from the fact that Zechariah's name literally means God remembers. He's like a walking billboard for God's faithfulness. So, in response to the waiting, to the longing, to this example of Zechariah and Elizabeth, I think we can group these responses under one banner, which is spending time with the Lord. Whether that's talking with him, praying, following his ways and becoming more like him, or praising his name in worship. God is with us whether we recognize it or not. That's the truth of this story and of the Bible from cover to cover. But it can be hard to recognize that because life is hard. Just because God is with us doesn't mean we don't experience sadness and trouble. And just because I'm saying this from the front of church doesn't make it easy to do. But hopefully, like I am, you can be encouraged by the life of Zechariah and Elizabeth. Not just because their prayer was answered, but because of how they lived before it was answered. The story of Zechariah and Elizabeth points to the magnificent, all-conquering coming of Jesus, but it also points to the challenges, the heartache, and the hopelessness that can come in that waiting time. As for me, I want the kind of relationship with God that can withstand that waiting. I want a strong and steadfast faith like Zechariah and Elizabeth's. I want a hope that conquers my situation, whatever that may be. So, inspired one final time by Zechariah and Elizabeth, I'm going to close in worship to the God who is with us, in the victory, but even more importantly, in the waiting and the hoping and the longing for victory. So if you'd like to stand, and maybe the band come back up. And I'd just love you all to close your eyes, and I'm going to finish by reading Zechariah's words of praise and prophecy over us all today. Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through his holy prophets of long ago. Salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. Amen.